Today we've got two Viofo dash cams with us, and these two are actually pretty similar at first glance. We've got the A229 Pro and the newer A329S, and both of these are dual-channel dash cams designed to give us 4K coverage up front and a dedicated rear camera as well. But there are quite a few differences once we start going through the hardware, settings, and features. So in this video, we're going to put both of them side by side and go through everything from the box and physical design to the recording options, parking features, connectivity, and how the two cameras actually differ. Starting with the boxes, there's actually quite a bit of similarity between these two. Both boxes highlight 4K recording, Sony's Starvis 2, Wi-Fi, and the dual camera setup, but the A329S puts more emphasis on some of its newer features, including faster Wi-Fi and SSD support for transferring footage. The A229 Pro, on the other hand, is more straightforward with its 4K HDR and Starvis 2 setup. On the side of the boxes, we can see some of the other features listed as well. Both cameras have built-in Wi-Fi, voice control, and a 2.4-inch HD screen, so there's definitely a lot of overlap here. And as we open them up, the overall packaging and the way everything is laid out is also pretty similar. Inside both boxes, we have the main camera, the rear camera, and then all of the cables and accessories we'll need to get everything installed. We'll get into all of those cables a little later, because there are quite a few of them, but for now, we've got the cigarette lighter power adapter and the little pry tool included with the cameras. We're not going to need the power adapters or the pry tool for what we're doing here, so we can just leave those in the boxes for now. We also have CPL filters for both cameras, and these are something we'll actually be using, so we're going to keep those out and take a look at them later. The rest of the cables can stay in the box for the moment. Now, putting the two cameras side by side, the first thing you'll notice is just how similar they are in overall size. The A229 Pro is on this side, and the A329S is right here. The displays are basically the same size, and even from the front, the overall footprint is very similar. The biggest visual difference is actually around the controls. On the A229 Pro, the physical buttons sit underneath the display in their own plastic section. On the A329S, the controls are integrated more closely into the front design, so the whole area looks a little different even though the basic button layout is very similar. We still have the same basic controls here for power, recording, GPS, microphone, and Wi-Fi. The buttons are doing pretty much the same jobs on both cameras, so if you're already familiar with one Viofo camera, there's not much of a learning curve moving over to the other one. We also have the same general ventilation area on both cameras. You can see the vents here, although Viofo uses a slightly different ventilation pattern on each model. There's also a speaker or audio vent area toward the bottom, depending on which camera we're looking at. And then up top, both cameras give us a USB Type-C power connection, so the basic power connection is in the same place, which is nice when you're comparing the two. Moving over to the sides, this is where we start seeing some more noticeable differences. On the left side of the A229 Pro, we have the USB connection, while the A329S has its own dedicated rear camera connection as well. Both cameras have ventilation along the sides, but again, the actual design is slightly different between the two. On the other side, we have the micro SD card slot, along with the camera connections for the rear and interior cameras. And this is another area where the A329S starts to separate itself a little bit, because the connector layout isn't exactly the same between these two models. The A329S uses a different connection setup for some of its additional cameras, so you can't just assume that every cable or camera from the A229 Pro will work with the A329S. The ports may look similar at first, but there are some differences here that you need to pay attention to when you're installing or expanding the system. Then we have the mounting system on the back. Both cameras use a mounting system that gives us the power connection through the mount, which is really convenient once the camera is installed. We can also remove the camera from the mount without having to completely mess with the wiring. So if you have the camera permanently installed in the vehicle and you want to take the main unit with you, you can simply detach it from the mount. That's a pretty useful design, especially if you're someone who doesn't want to leave the camera sitting in the vehicle all the time. Can also be adjusted to get the camera positioned at the angle you want, so both of these give us plenty of adjustment once they're installed. Other than the different port and button layouts we've already looked at, the two cameras are still remarkably similar in terms of the overall physical design. Now let's actually power them on and see how they behave. We'll start with the A229 Pro. As soon as we connect the power cable, the camera gets power and starts booting up. And what's interesting here is that recording starts automatically as soon as the camera comes on. Now we'll do the exact same thing with the A329S. Once we connect the power cable, it also gets power and starts booting up. The A229 Pro does seem to boot a little faster, while the A329S takes just a little longer to get going. But even though the A229 Pro gets power first, the screens end up coming on at almost the same time. So there is a slight difference in the boot up time, but once both cameras are running, the experience is basically the same. Now let's jump into the settings and see what we actually get on these two cameras. And this is where things start getting more interesting, because even though the cameras look similar, the recording options aren't exactly the same. We'll start with the video settings. The first thing we have here is resolution. On the A229 Pro, we have a few options. We get 4K at 30 frames per second, 4K 21:9 at 30 frames per second, 2K at 30 frames per second, and 1080p at 30 frames per second. Now, if we move over to the A329S, we get quite a few more frame rate options. We have 4K at 60 frames per second, 4K 21:9 at 60 frames per second, 4K at 30 frames per second, 4K 21:9 at 30 frames per second, 2K at 60 frames per second, and 2K at 30 frames per second. So this is one of the first major differences we can see. The A329S gives us significantly more flexibility with frame rates, especially if you want 60 FPS recording. At the same time, the A229 Pro actually gives us a 1080p option that isn't available on the A329S. So the A329S gives us more high frame rate choices, while the A229 Pro gives us that extra lower resolution option. For our setup, we generally want to keep the resolution as high as possible, because that's going to give us the best overall detail in the footage. So we'll keep the video quality set to high on both cameras and move on to the next setting. The next option is video bitrate. On the A229 Pro, this is the second option in the video settings, while on the A329S, it's the third option. And once we go into bitrate, both cameras give us basically the same choices. We have low, normal, high, and maximum. For everyday use, we're going to keep this at normal. You can push the bitrate higher if you want the camera to retain more information in the footage, but remember, higher bitrate also means the camera is going to use more storage space. And since these cameras can already generate a lot of footage, especially when we're running multiple channels, we don't necessarily want to eat through the memory card faster than we need to. So for our setup, normal is a good balance, and we'll leave it there. Next, we have HDR. The A229 Pro gives us HDR options for the front and rear cameras. The front camera has the usual off, on, and auto options, and the rear camera has its own HDR setting as well. On the A329S, we get HDR controls for the front, rear, and interior cameras. The front camera gives us the same basic options, while the rear camera has its own on and off control. And because the A329S can support the additional interior camera, there's also a dedicated HDR option for that camera. So again, the basic HDR controls are very similar, but the A329S gives us more control because we're dealing with more camera channels. After HDR, we have loop recording, and this part is the same on both cameras. We can choose between 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and 10 minutes. For a dash cam, we generally want loop recording enabled because that's what allows the camera to keep recording continuously without eventually filling the card and stopping. Older footage can be overwritten while important or locked clips are kept protected. So we'll keep the loop recording enabled and move to the next setting. Right after loop recording, we have the record audio option, and on both the A229 Pro and the A329S, we get the same basic control here, which is simply on or off. For a dash cam, we usually want this turned on because having the audio recorded along with the video can be useful later, especially if we're trying to document what happened during an incident. So we'll leave record audio turned on and move to the next setting. Next, we have exposure value, and this is another setting that both cameras give us. We can adjust the exposure separately for the front, rear, and interior cameras. So if one camera is consistently looking a little too bright or too dark, we can fine-tune it without changing the exposure on the other cameras. The options are basically the same across both models here. So again, there's not much difference between the A229 Pro and A329S when it comes to exposure control. Then we have the G-sensor settings. Here we can turn the G-sensor off or choose low, medium, or high sensitivity. The G-sensor is important because it's what helps the camera recognize a sudden impact or significant movement. If the camera detects something that looks like an accident or collision, it can protect that video file so it doesn't get overwritten by normal loop recording. For everyday driving, we don't want this set unnecessarily high, because things like potholes or rough roads could potentially trigger it too often. So we're going to keep the G-sensor at medium, and we'll do the same thing on both cameras.
Next, we have all of our different stamp options. This is where we can choose what information gets displayed on the recorded footage. We have things like the date stamp, GPS speed, GPS coordinates, custom text, license plate information, and other recording details. We also have the option to display the resolution and HDR information along with the vehicle voltage and other details depending on the camera. The A229 Pro has a few of these options arranged slightly differently, while the A329S gives us some additional controls, but the overall idea is the same. We can also customize the text color here. There are several options available, including white, yellow, cyan, and gold. For our footage, we'll keep things simple and use the standard settings so we don't have a bunch of extra information covering the video. After that, we have time-lapse recording. This can be turned off, or we can select different frame rate options depending on how we want the time-lapse footage to be captured. This is more useful for situations where we want to monitor a vehicle over a longer period without continuously recording full-frame video, since a time-lapse can reduce the amount of storage being used. We'll leave it off for our normal driving setup and move on. Next, we have the interior camera settings. This is one area where the menus aren't exactly the same between these two cameras. On the A229 Pro, when we go into the interior camera section, we get a few different choices for when the camera should be active. We can have it off, turn it on while driving, or have it operate only while the vehicle is parked. The A329S gives us a more straightforward on or off option in this particular menu. There's also an interior camera fisheye option. Since an interior camera is designed to cover a much wider area inside the vehicle, the fisheye view can be useful when we want to capture more of the cabin rather than focusing on a narrow section. So if you're using one of these with an interior camera, this is something you'll want to check depending on how you want the cabin footage to look. For our setup, we'll keep the interior camera enabled. Next, we have the IR LED settings. And again, both cameras give us basically the same options here: auto, off, and on. For an interior camera, infrared illumination can be especially useful at night because it helps the camera see inside the cabin when there isn't much ambient light. We're just going to leave this on auto so the camera can handle the illumination automatically depending on the conditions. Now we're getting into one of the more important parts of the settings, especially if you're buying a dash cam because you want protection while the vehicle is parked. So let's go into the parking mode settings. On the A229 Pro, the first thing we have is vehicle battery protection, and when we go inside that setting, we can configure the cutoff behavior, including the cutoff voltage.
This is important because when a dash cam is running while the vehicle is parked, we obviously don't want it draining the car's battery to the point where the vehicle can't start. So the camera gives us protection settings to help manage that power draw. Now, under parking mode itself, this is where we start seeing some differences between the two cameras. On the A229 Pro, we have options including off, time-lapse, low bitrate recording, and auto event detection. So depending on what we choose, the camera can either continuously capture footage at a lower rate, record using lower bitrate video, or wait for an event to trigger recording. The A329S gives us a more extensive set of parking options. We get hybrid parking recording, low power impact detection, low bitrate recording, auto event detection, and time-lapse recording. Viofo officially lists these as the A329S's 5 supported parking modes, so this is one of the areas where the newer camera gives us more flexibility. And the hybrid parking recording mode is particularly interesting because it gives us another way to balance continuous coverage with power consumption. We also have a parking recording timer on the A229 Pro. Here we can choose how long we want the camera to remain in parking mode. We can leave it off or select periods such as 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and longer fixed durations, going all the way up to 48 hours. That's useful if you don't necessarily want the camera monitoring the vehicle indefinitely after you park. Next, we have Parking G-Sensor. Just like the regular G-Sensor, we can choose low, medium, or high sensitivity. This controls how sensitive the camera is to impacts while the vehicle is parked. We're going to keep this at medium. That gives us a good middle ground without making the camera overly sensitive to every little movement or vibration. Parking Motion Detection. Again, we get low, medium, and high sensitivity options. This is different from the G-Sensor because we're talking about movement being detected in the camera's field of view rather than simply detecting a physical impact on the vehicle. For our setup, we'll keep this at medium as well. Next, we have Parking GPS, which can be turned on or off. We also have the ADAS option here, and that's something we can enable or disable depending on whether we want those driver assistance alerts. The A229 Pro has these basic parking-related controls. Parking file storage. This basically lets us choose where the parking footage is going to be stored. On the A329S, we have the option to use the SD card, and because this camera also supports external SSD storage, the storage side of the A329S is considerably more flexible. Viofo says the A329S can support up to a 512GB SD card, along with an external SSD of up to 4 terabytes. That's a pretty big advantage if you're planning to use the camera heavily, especially if you're recording multiple channels or leaving parking protection enabled for extended periods. And then we get to something the A329S has that we don't have on the A229 Pro, geofencing. Here we can choose different zones, and we have Zone 1, Zone 2, and Zone 3. I'm going to select Zone 2 here. Once we enable it, the camera can use the GPS location to determine whether we're inside the configured area. We can also adjust the circular radius with options like 15, 30, 50, and 100 meters. We'll set this to 30 meters for now. And as you can see, the camera has picked up the GPS location, so the geofencing setup is ready to go. This is one of those features that you might not use every day, but if you have specific parking locations where you want different behavior from the camera, it's a pretty useful addition.
Now, going back into the parking settings, we also have parking impact notification. This is another feature that's available on the A329S, but isn't included in the A229 Pro's menu here. The idea is that if the camera detects an impact while the vehicle is parked, it can notify you about that event. So instead of simply having the footage sitting on the memory card, the camera can actually alert you that something happened while you were away from the vehicle. That's a nice addition for people who are using the dash cam primarily as a parking security system. And that basically covers the main parking-related settings we're looking at here. The A229 Pro already gives us a pretty solid set of parking tools, but the A329S adds more flexibility with things like hybrid parking recording, geofencing, parking impact notifications, and its broader storage options. Okay, after that we have image rotation and mirror. Here we get the usual options for adjusting the orientation of the footage.
We have the interior camera rotation, interior camera mirror, rear camera rotation, and rear camera mirror. But one thing we noticed here is that the A329S gives us an additional interior camera option that we don't get on the A229 Pro. On the A229 Pro, when we go into the interior camera settings, we can choose whether the interior camera stays on all the time, only while driving, or only while parking. So we'll keep that turned on for our setup. And then for image rotate and mirror, everything is pretty straightforward. If the camera is mounted in a different orientation, or the rear camera is installed in a way that flips the image, we can correct that directly from here. Next, we have custom text stamp. This lets us add our own text to the recorded footage. So if there's something specific we want displayed on the video, we can enter it here. Then we have the license plate number option, where we can enter the vehicle's license plate information. This is useful if we want that information automatically included in the footage, instead of having to add it later during editing. And then we have something that's particularly interesting on the A329S, which is multiplex video. This option basically allows multiple camera views to be combined into a single video display. Since the A329S supports multiple channels and has more flexibility with its camera configuration, this gives us another way to work with the front, rear, and interior footage. The exact options available here depend on which additional cameras are connected. So right now, we're not seeing much to change because we're just working through the main camera setup. But once the rear or interior cameras are connected, this is where some of those additional viewing options come into play. Next, we have live video source. When we open this up right now, we are basically seeing the front camera as the available live source, so there's nothing complicated here. Once we have the additional cameras connected, we can use the controls to switch between the available camera feeds. Then we have privacy mode. This is pretty straightforward. We can turn it on or off. We'll leave it enabled for now and move on. And that's basically everything we wanted to check under the main video settings. Now we're going to move over to system settings, because this is where we have things like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, time, display, voice control, GPS, and all the other general camera controls. The first option here is Wi-Fi. Both cameras give us the same basic Wi-Fi options, including the 2.4 GHz and 5 GHz bands. For our setup, we'll leave it on 2.4 GHz, since that's the more common option and generally gives us better compatibility across different devices. And of course, Wi-Fi is useful because we can connect the dash cam to the Viofo app and access or manage footage without having to physically remove the memory card.
Next, we have Bluetooth function. This is where we can configure the Bluetooth-related controls, including the button functions. The options are mostly similar between the two cameras, although the A329S gives us a few additional controls. So depending on how we're using the Bluetooth remote or other supported Bluetooth accessories, we can assign the available functions here. Then we have time zone. This one is pretty simple. We'll just select our local time zone based on where we're using the camera. After that, we have time format. We can choose between 12-hour and 24-hour formats. Since we're setting this up for our US audience, we'll use the 12-hour format here. Next is daylight saving time. Since we're in the United States, we can turn this on so the camera can account for daylight saving changes. Both cameras have this option, although the exact menu presentation is slightly different. Then we have date and time. Interestingly, both cameras are able to set the date and time automatically, so we don't really need to sit here and manually enter everything. Once the GPS is available, the camera can use that information to keep the time accurate. Next, we have boot delay. This controls how long the camera waits during startup before beginning its normal operation. Again, this is one of those settings that most people probably won't need to touch very often, so we're going to leave it at the standard setting. Then we have the LED settings.
On the A229 Pro, the LED options are pretty straightforward with controls for the available indicators. But when we move over to the A329S, we get a few more options. We can separately control things like the front LED, rear LED, and interior indicators depending on the connected cameras. For example, the front LED can be set to all on or all off, while the rear and interior indicators have their own controls. This is actually useful if you're trying to keep the camera as discreet as possible inside the vehicle, especially when you're using it for parking surveillance at night. We also have the parking mode LED settings, where we can control the front, rear, and interior indicators separately on the A329S. So again, the A329S gives us a little more control here compared with the A229 Pro. Next we have beep sound. This controls the sounds the camera makes when we're interacting with it. We have options for things like button sounds, boot sounds, or all sounds. Personally, we're going to turn most of that off because the constant beeping every time we press a button can get pretty annoying. So we'll just keep the boot sound enabled. That way we still get an audible indication when the camera starts up without having the camera beep every time we're navigating through the menu. And this is another area where the A329S gives us an additional option. We can have voice notifications turned off or on, and on the A329S, there's also an option for only critical alerts. That means the camera can focus its voice notifications on important situations rather than constantly talking to us. For example, critical alerts can include things like an impact being detected during parking recording or a memory card problem. Viofo also documents this as a feature of the newer A329S firmware. We're going to leave voice notifications enabled because they can actually be useful when we're driving and don't want to keep looking down at the screen. Then we have voice notification volume. This one is pretty simple. We can adjust the volume level, and we're going to keep it high so the camera's alerts are easy to hear.
Now we have one of the features that I actually like on these cameras, voice control. We'll turn this on. Once it's enabled, we can control certain camera functions without physically touching the camera. And the available voice commands are basically the same on both cameras. For example, we can tell the camera to take a photo, turn the audio on or off, turn the screen on or off, turn Wi-Fi on, or switch between the different camera views. So when we're driving, this can be pretty convenient, because we don't have to reach over and start pressing buttons on the dash cam. Next we have GPS. We'll leave GPS turned on, that way the camera can record the GPS information along with the footage, including things like speed and location data, depending on which stamps we've enabled. Then we have speed units. Since we're setting this up for the US market, we're going to use mph instead of kilometers per hour. Next we have screensaver. Here we can choose how long the display stays active before the screen turns off. We have options like 3 minutes, 5 seconds, 15 seconds, and so on. For a dash cam, we generally don't need the display running all the time, so using a short screensaver period makes sense. It keeps the display from becoming a distraction while we're driving. Here we can select between 50 Hz and 60 Hz. Since we're in the US, we'll use 60 Hz. This is important because matching the camera's frequency setting to the local power frequency can help reduce flickering under certain artificial lights. Next, we have language. There are several language options available, but we're going to keep ours set to English. Format reminder. Then we have format reminder. We can set this to off, 15 days or 60 days. Basically, this is a reminder to format the memory card periodically. That's something we do recommend keeping in mind with any dash cam, because the camera is constantly writing and overwriting files, so periodically formatting the card can help keep things running properly. Then we have default settings. If we ever mess around with the settings and want to bring everything back to the factory configuration, this is where we can reset the camera. We're not going to reset anything right now because we've already configured the settings we want. And finally, we have version. This is where we can check the current firmware and software information for the camera. So that's basically everything we wanted to go through inside the system settings.
Now let's go back out of the settings and check the file list. When we open the file list, we have our videos and photos. If we go into videos, we can see all the footage that the camera has already recorded. And one thing I like here is that we can actually play the recorded footage directly on the camera itself. So if we need to quickly check something without connecting to a phone or taking the memory card out, we can do that right from the camera. And the same thing applies to photos. We can open the Photos section and look through the images that we've captured. So both the A229 Pro and A329S give us this basic playback functionality directly from the camera. Now we're going to connect the rear camera and see how the two cameras handle the additional camera feed. On the A329S, we have this port specifically labeled for connecting the rear camera, so we'll plug that in here. And on the other camera, we'll connect the rear camera to its corresponding rear camera port. Once we connect it, we can see the camera recognizing the rear camera and starting the connection process. And there we go, the rear camera is connected. This is also where we can see that unique connection design on the A329S that we were talking about earlier. The connector is different, but once everything is plugged in, the camera automatically recognizes the rear camera. Now let's check what we can actually do with the two camera views. If we press the Wi-Fi button here, we can switch the live view. The first press brings up the rear camera. Press it again and the rear camera becomes smaller while the front camera takes the main position. Press it again and we can make the rear camera the larger view while the front camera stays smaller at the top, and then another press brings us back to the front camera as the main view. So we have a few different ways to arrange the front and rear camera views directly on the display. This is pretty useful when we're checking the cameras during installation, because we can immediately confirm that both cameras are working and positioned correctly. And since we already enabled voice control, let's actually test it. Show rear camera. And there we go, the camera switches to the rear view. Now let's try show front camera, and it switches right back to the front camera. We can also use commands like turn off screen, turn on screen, and show both cameras. So the voice control isn't just something that's sitting inside the menu, we can actually use it to control the camera while we're driving. And finally, let's test one more important feature, the collision video lock. Both of these cameras have a G sensor, so if the camera detects a significant impact, it can automatically lock the video file. So let's give the camera a little shake here and simulate an impact. And there we go. The camera recognizes the movement and locks the video. This is a really useful feature because if you actually get into an accident or even hit a serious bump, you don't have to immediately reach over and manually protect the footage. The camera can automatically lock that recording so it doesn't get overwritten by the normal loop recording process. And that's especially important with a dash cam because the whole point is to have that footage available when you actually need it. And that's basically it. We've gone through the two cameras side by side, checked the physical differences, went through the video settings, parking settings, system settings, connected the rear cameras, tested the different viewing modes, and even checked the voice commands and collision recording. From the outside, the A229 Pro and the A329S look pretty similar, and a lot of the basic controls are also very similar. But once we start going through the menus, we can see that the A329S is the more feature-heavy camera, especially when it comes to things like 4K 60 FPS recording, Wi-Fi 6, external SSD support, expanded parking modes, geofencing, parking impact notifications, and additional camera controls. Viofo's current A329S documentation confirms the expanded parking system and external SSD support. And that's really what separates these two. The A229 Pro still gives us a very capable dual-channel setup with a lot of the important dashcam features, while the A329S is clearly designed for people who want more recording flexibility, faster footage transfer, more storage, and a more advanced parking system. So that was our full look at the Viofo A229 Pro versus the Viofo A329S. If you have any questions about either of them, let us know down in the comments. We'll put the updated price and purchase links down in the description for your convenience. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.